Good afternoon, class. I'm just getting around to recording this screencast. We spent some time today. We started by viewing a YouTube, actually a TED Talk, where a gentleman, Andrew Nisakorek, was discussing some of the fundamental problems of petroleum states or petrostates. And we use this as an introduction to talk about some of the democratic weaknesses of countries that rely upon oil, and sort of by extension, some of the further challenges that oil presents in the context of our Unit 3, which is carbon, our natural environment, and our mass political systems and movements. And so I'm going to click through here because this is something that we covered in class today. And our objective today was to explore how oil, as it becomes sort of an energy or a carbon energy resource of choice during the mid-20th century, how it is accompanied by a prolonged period of what we could call anti-democratic, or at least in the case of the comments that I'll be making today, it's not so much that it thwarts democracy. It does that too, but it also thwarts the sovereignty of sovereign nation states over their own resources. And I guess I can't tell you that if it weren't for big oil companies, that nation states like Iraq and Iran would have become democracies. It's quite possible that they wouldn't have. And they certainly didn't with the oil company influences. But it strikes me as something that would have been closer to the democratic had those nation states at least had control over their own petroleum reserves underground. So that's sort of the spirit in which we are undergoing the comments that follow. So in class we talked a little bit about how in the 1950s the country of Iran made an effort to nationalize its oil resources. And as I was speaking in class today, we know that both the United States and Great Britain and various oil companies thereof, whether it was British Petroleum or members of the Seven Sisters oil cartel, which consisted of 5 U.S. oil companies, companies like Aramco, Chevron, Texaco, so on and so forth, that they had an outsized influence in events that were going on around the world. And in some ways we can think of these lessons and the behavior of these oil companies as these are responses to lessons they've learned about how important it is, at least from the standpoint of their profits and their bottom line, to maintain access and flow of global energy reserves. And we know from instances like Ludlow and other issues talked about by Timothy Mitchell in Carbon Democracy that there were some early challenges to energy companies having to deal with pesky coal miners and union activists who were advocating for greater representation and power, and they were using energy, carbon energy sources to help them make their points known. So some of those lessons are learned and then they're being adapted by big energy corporations in this next round of energy strategy and planning. And this next round we could say was oil related as opposed to coal related. In response to the efforts by the nation state of Iran in the mid-20th century to assert control over its oil reserves, and another way of saying that is to nationalize their oil reserves, Great Britain and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which sounds kind of funny because the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company is going to act against the nation of Iran, and it's going to blockade and boycott Iranian oil which creates all sorts of hardship for the Iranian economy and makes it difficult for the political leadership there that is trying to take control over its resources. And so in the midst of this, we see this picture here of the United States and the soon-to-be Iranian leader, Shah Pahlavi, who in 1953 is going to be swept into power with the support of the United States. And what's interesting is in the United States at this time, you wouldn't have heard any conversation about oil politics and oil strategy. It was oftentimes framed in questions like the Shah is going to better help the United States hold the line against communism and its spread throughout the world. So oftentimes the ways in which these stories were presented to trusting audiences around the world, in this case the United States audience, didn't necessarily make any mention of oil and the considerations for oil. That's the military coup of 1953 that brings the Shah to power. So Iran was a case in point in how oil brings about an undemocratic and an approach to global energy supply that does not recognize the sovereignty of various nation states. And right next door, we have another example of this, because in Iraq, at about the same time, maybe just a few years later, we see evidence that British Petroleum, now a powerful global oil company, if I'm not mistaken, I think British Petroleum is the name that was of the former Anglo-Iranian oil company. It changes its name to British Petroleum, which is probably a more appropriate name, because Iran certainly has very little to do with the efforts of this oil company by this time. And as you read in your reading for class today, one of the most amazing aspects of oil development in Iraq during the 50s and 60s is just how mysterious the information and the sense of the overall reserves. The information about Iraq's oil remained a mystery to the Iraqi people themselves. So the oil executives, the oil prospectors and engineers were trying to intentionally keep the Iraqi people from knowing just how much oil they had. And there's a fascinating explanation for this. The reason that the first part here is that Iraq's oil was clearly being developed based on the interests of the core. You'll remember our use of the word core from the first unit that we explored this quarter. It was being managed for the core, not the periphery. The periphery would have been the Iraqi people themselves, where this oil was discovered. But the British and British Petroleum were trying to preserve Iraqi oil because they wanted to use it as a buffer. So I put here a contingency plan for sabotage. So the idea is that if global supplies of oil in other parts of the world, and I mentioned Mexico, in the United States, we just saw what happened to go down in Iran, oil supplies in Saudi Arabia. What British Petroleum wanted to do is preserve this Iraqi oil reserve so that if something happened in those other places, if people protested and demonstrated in a democratic display of wanting more profits and wanting better working conditions, British Petroleum could then pivot to Iraq and make up for any lost oil elsewhere in the global oil economy by drawing upon Iraq's oil. And in some ways you have to give them credit. Wow, that's pretty shrewd, right? That's forward thinking. But if you think about it, what that means is the people of Iraq are seeing their profits, are seeing their oil resources completely held hostage by the rather, contingent or just in case sort of rainy day plans of British Petroleum. And that strikes many as yeah, not a very democratic and not a very sovereign approach to Iraq's oil supplies. The pictures of this gentleman here, this is the leader Qasim, who is going to be taken out in a military coup in 1963 as he's advocating to assert sovereignty and to try to nationalize Iraq's oil reserves. So one lesson you can take if you're a leader in the developing world, if you upset British or US oil policies and oil strategies, you will quickly become a public enemy. And you can also ask people like Saddam Hussein, you can ask people like Hugo Chavez, you can ask people like Muammar Gaddafi, because all of these people share that same fate. They put their oil interests above the Corps' oil interests, and it hurt them tremendously. The third explanation that we encounter in your reading is this, what we'll call containerization. Another way that oil companies start to work around the threats posed by workers and organized labor in the oil industry is by innovations in the way they ship oil as a commodity or as a natural resource. By simplifying the handling and making it so that oil is handled less and less, they make it more difficult. They take fewer people out of the oil distribution process, and by eliminating more and more people, there's less and less chance or less and less likelihood of collective labor, strikes, so on and so forth. So it makes oil a more difficult energy source to restrict. And this, of course, comes at the expense of skilled labor, so people who might be operating, train transits, people who might be operating cranes. There's still going to be cranes, as you can sort of make out in this picture, but you're taking fewer steps out, and that's making it more difficult for people to control it. And then indirectly, this also creates a greater demand for manufacturing overseas. So it's going to affect unionized labor, skilled labor in other ways too, because all these empty ships that are dropping oil in the Middle East are going to be looking for cargoes to bring back to their original point of oil delivery. And so they're going to start looking to countries like Vietnam to manufacture things like t-shirts and so on and so forth. And so you're indirectly stimulating manufacturing overseas, which of course is weakening organized labor in places like the United States. Okay, and then finally, let me just close with this. Militarization is another consequence, and so one of the ways that countries like the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, one of the ways that they create a balance of trade with oil exporting countries like Iraq and Saudi Arabia is they provide arms and weapons. And so what this means is, rather than having to trade away precious money or gold to pay for this oil, they're instead going to pay for it with weapons. And this does a couple things. One, it makes it so that the oil exporting petrostates don't need to have a healthy civil society because they have a powerful, armed, militarized government that can keep its people at bay if necessary. So it becomes a substitute for civil society. And it also allows them to, maintain order. Again, the undemocratic statecraft that they employ, they're also going to have to be mindful of putting down resistance by neighboring countries, because there will be increasingly some Arab nationalist forces in neighboring countries that don't appreciate the fact that some people in the Arab Middle East are getting rich while many people remain poor. And if you know anything about the Islamic faith, one of the key principles and values of it is that people be treated with equality and they share in the benefits of the community wealth. So with that, I will stop.